are the
Okay, cool. So that's why it's interesting. It's also very interesting, Mike, the way you ask your question. You know, what is nature? Nature. Aristotle talks about things that have natures, but he doesn't talk about nature as some grand substantive. Right? Some things are physis, right? They're physical. They are natural. To say something that is physical is to say it's natural. It's because the motions that they're capable of are partly explainable by an internal principle, and their motions cannot be completely explained only by external forces.
That helps a lot. Thank you.
Right, and we tend to use nature as like the totality of the physical, right? And that leaves a little bit in the gray zone. What is the physical? Here, at least, all of these concepts are intertwined through the idea of an internal principle of motion. And he names obviously plants and animals, but he also names the elements, right? Fire moves in a certain way, water moves in a certain way, earth moves in a certain way, and air moves in a certain way.
On Saturday, right?
Sorry. Let's see. Anyway, so fire moves the way it does because it's fire and not because of something happening to it. Right? Earth moves the way it does because of its nature as earth, not because of something happening to it. And so anything composed of elements, which is to say everything that can move, will have something in it that has an internal principle of motion. So the cloak, as Peter said, will have the internal principle of motion, but not because it's a cloak, but because it's made of things that are composed of the element earth. And earth is what gives it its internal principle of motion. That's why it falls rather than soars like firewood. But obviously, if it were made out of fire, if you could make a cloak out of fire, it would tend to ascend rather than descend. All right, so
do you want to? You can mute and Jean-G. I don't have powers because I'm not a co-host because I got kicked off being co-host.
Oh dear. Yeah. So anyway, so does anybody else have any thoughts about this whole nature versus artifact or product of craft?
At the risk of probably repeating myself and it not resulting in what I'm trying to get at exactly, but can we use the concept of bed? So I'm walking along the forest. I see a bed of leaves. I lay down on that bed. I call it a bed.
Okay.
And that bed of leaves becomes a bed.
Well,
it becomes an artifact purely by virtue of me naming it so.
Well, wait. I don't so.
Wouldn't that be the case?
No.
Because it's leaves on the ground under the tree, and I'm using it for a purpose. So I'm making it become something that it was not. So suddenly it's an artifact. But what made it an artifact? My naming it so.
I see.
I don't think so, because you'd have to ask yourself what techne went into making that, and the answer is none. It was there, and you flopped down on it. There was no process of making.
But isn't
no
the knowledge
was involved?
Wouldn't the knowledge be the techne? I mean, when you see something and you see an opportunity, you call that techne, and we celebrate it and give you lots of money. But it's because you just found out that, super glue that worked on the space shuttle became super glue in the bottle in your wood shop. It seems to me the naming of it was the impetus for it to become the artifact, yet nothing materially changes with it.
I'd agree that it requires a bit of philosophical finesse to articulate the difference between the techne of actually making something, an artifact, and the skills of recognizing that that bed of leaves could be used for that purpose. I agree that it would take a certain amount of philosophical finesse to articulate those two differences, but I think Aristotle can and does do that. Like I think techne is just a different thing from recognizing that something can be useful as is.
For techne, for sure. But I'm trying to figure out the difference. If nature is just an arbitrary definition here of an internal principle of internal movement of some sort of self-determination, that word hasn't been used, but I'm interested in the nature aspect, that the claim that's being made regarding nature versus artifact. And I'm trying to see how that actually does make sense. You know, is it intelligible? It does if I accept it at a certain level, but I immediately go into a regress, it seems to me, if I push it. And the way I'm thinking about it is, if I were to read Aristotle without reading in modern science, that's what's being asked of me right now in our class. We want to read Aristotle as if we don't have any idea of modern science, and then we're trying to see if that actually works. And I think it does. Well, I mean,
modern science,
practically, can I give up being a modern person? You know, this is another bigger issue, but
modern science doesn't have anything to do with Aristotle. I mean, they're talking different purposes. I mean, I don't think anything.
No. I'm saying that's the case. But it also means putting up on the shelf, doesn't it? That we are in this modern world with modern science, and we need to subject what Aristotle says, not just in his own terms, but we do it in our own terms today also.
Only if you think philosophy and science are competitors and are on the same turf. And I don't think that's true.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think I can go both ways depending on the situation. I think. I don't know.
Clark, I think you're raising very super salient issues, and I want to get other voices to, because it ultimately affects, you know, how are we to understand what we're doing together with Aristotle, right? I mean, what am I asking? What kind of sacrifices am I making you undergo? Do you have to sacrifice modern science on the altar of Aristotle? Yeah, I hope not. But the point is that people are coming at this, you know, with that preconception that this is what's being asked of them. Then obviously that's going to create inner resistances, right? And so I think it's really great to talk about this, you know, and to get different voices and see how they're relating to Aristotle and what the relationship is to science. So that's great. Tyler, you got your hand up. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think focusing on movement, we can also think of the act of making, which involves movement. And the flower bed, right, was not made to be the way it is for the purpose of being a bed,
right,
by someone else. It may serve the purpose of being a bed, but that doesn't mean that's how it came to be what it is. So the difference between the artifact and the plant bed is how they were made. It's not only about purpose, right? Lots of different things can serve several purposes that they weren't even made to serve.
It has to do with the form. What is the source of the form or the actuality of the thing? In one case, in the techne case, the form was in the artisan or the craftsperson, and that is why the material takes the form it does. In the case of your bed, it was just there, and you saw it would happen to coincidentally meet a purpose, but your need for a bed does not explain why the leaves were sitting as it were.
Right. So I think people are putting a finger on something important, that Aristotle's analysis rests on the question, rests on this idea that certain things come to be what they are in virtue of an inner principle. So a plant comes to be a plant, you know, from seed to adult, in virtue of this inner principle of movement. Whereas the cloak or the bed, none of these come to be on the basis of their own inner principle, come to be what they are. They require a principle of manufacture, in which we manufacture the artifact, and so the different parts come together from an external source and bring them together. And so he's looking at this whole idea of coming to be, right? We're in the physics, we're studying change and coming to be. And the primary coming to be he's looking at here is, the plant coming to be a plant, not the kind of coming to be like the plant coming to be squashed underneath my shoe, which is also coming to be, right? But that's not an internal principle of the plant. The plant doesn't come to be underneath my shoe because of the nature of the plant. That's coincidental. So if we just think, okay, so fences don't build themselves, but plants and animals do. And fire propagates fire, and when fire propagates fire, that second fire behaves like the first one and has its own internal principle of motion. And I think that's the set of phenomenological data that Aristotle is looking at and saying, there is this difference, and it's quite evident. And how are we to account for this? How are we to account for this difference? So I see Philip's hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, one fairly obvious thing that to be said about the idea of a human seeing a bed of leaves or flowers and lying down and sleeping is an animal could do that exact same thing, and often does, right? So a bear could see that exact same bit of ground and lie down and have a nap there as well. Now, the issue was addressed that the human can do something in addition to what the bear can do. The human can name it as a bed, right? So the human can, as they are lying down, they say, I'm treating this as if it were a bed. So I guess that gets to the differences between the soul of the human and the animal, right? So both souls seem capable of utilizing that patch of ground as a bed. The human soul seems to have an extra capability, which we'll call naming. Does that naming rise to the level of techne? I would say no for Aristotle, but I agree that it needs to be debated. It needs, I'd need to argue that better. So I'll stop there, but I'm just wondering if what people make of that.
Well, I would just like to jump in and say, if I name what a stack of books, or something better, like a stack of books, a bed, and I try to lie on it and they all collapse underneath me, right? My naming it didn't make it so. So the name isn't what's salient here about using the plant bed as a bed. I mean, what you're seeing is a formal similarity in the function of these plant beds, right? That's what you're doing is you're grasping the form of the bed in the plant bed and thereby using it as that. So it's not actually the name that we have to take one step back and say, why are you naming that bed and not the patch of moss next to it or not the stream next to it? Right? It's not the name that does it. It's the recognition of the functional identity of what you're so naming. This can be a bed, being what it is. And so, right. So the recognition of some similarity is prior to the naming, and the naming doesn't create the functionality. And so that's why
that would be to make naming even less related to techne. Like, that's the direction I also want to go in, is to make a clear distinction between techne, the making of an artifact, and just naming the artifact. And I mean, I agree that both are human practices. I agree that there's some interrelated aspects, but just the naming isn't doing nearly as much work as techne by any stretch.
Right, and if we're looking at coming to be, right, my naming something doesn't make it what I name it. But if I produce it, if I manually put the pieces together such that it functions in a certain way, namely a bed, then I can sleep on it, right? Then it's not the name that makes the bed, it's the techne of putting material parts together in the right way.
I just throw this in. So the identification of a function requires some distinction.
Yeah.
And those distinctions involve names. They involve certain definitions of certain names of making distinctions to identify functions.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm not sure it takes naming out of the loop from what you said. It's,
Well, you know,
the naming is in there because
yeah.
there's so many functions that occur all the time
Yes.
that I might discover, and in my discovery, I name it.
Yeah.
You look at the history of naming the New World, you know, for Christopher Columbus. There's huge epistemological problems, huge, you know, and Columbus never even agreed that he discovered a new continent.
Right.
I mean, it's just amazing to me. I'm just going off subject. My mind just goes all over the place. Sorry.
No, but that also
I'll
brings
stop
up
there.
that notion of naming. The reason you name something like that is you've discovered that it has some sort of a being to it that it didn't previously have for you in some sense. There's some new distinction, some new unity, or something about it's kind of is a discovery. So it is, but it's related to being and not really. That doesn't mean it has a principle of motion or anything. But
right. So,
by the way, Michael, you're also the only one who can knock down hands. So Philip's hand is still up from.
oh,
You say you take on a lot of responsibilities when you kick me off.
yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, I should mention that at my end, I can raise the hand, but I have no way to lower the hand at my end. Sorry.
Okay, that's all good. Good to know. Thanks. Yeah. So this nominal problem feels like it's being thrust upon Aristotle.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's
Probably
like,
is.
damn it, Aristotle, why aren't you more of a nominalist? Or if you'd be a better philosopher if you were a nominalist or something. But so you're arguing for,
Well, I don't know.
you're trying to, there is this nominalist thing coming in, and which might butt up against seeing what Aristotle's doing. So I just want to point that out, that it's so to speak, it's not a concern that rises up from the text, but it's one that a modern would legitimately ask, you know, who gives a lot of credence to the naming, you know, analytic philosophers used to like to call it baptizing, giving something a name and thereby giving it some kind of designator that can be that can identify it over in different places and different times. Yeah. So we can pursue this. We can pursue something else. I'm open to everything. I mean, techne is very, very important concept here. You know, insofar as it is the act of let's see. Well, it's the act of production, and the act of production is always guided by an idea of what is to be produced, right? And so that whole complex, you know, what we tend to like to think of as the technomorph God, right? God has this idea of what the universe is supposed to be, and then he's the great artificer and producer and creates the universe. And people legitimately make fun of this notion of God. And I just want to say that, you know, that Aristotle is thinking about nature in opposition to precisely this model that I just gave in the theological version of. Whatever's nature, it's not that. That is the realm of techne. So I got a couple of hands. So I see Peter first, then Tyler.
Yeah, so earlier you made the point that Aristotle at least introduces this distinction between, in context of a further distinction between artifacts and, like plants and animals, things that do have a nature. The artifacts definitely get there are the artifacts of a techne, of somebody, a craftsperson or whatever, who has a design in mind, as it were, and then realizes that design in materials and stuff around
Right.
him. But I think that that is true, but I also don't think that completely covers that doesn't exhaust the possibilities of things that don't have a nature. It's not like that anything. I don't think it's true that because you look at it like a rock. As maybe you could say there's no distinction between rock as rock and rock as the earth or whatever it is it's made of. Earth has the nature to fall down or stay down, but is wool, or like the cloak is made of wool, not really animal. I mean, it seems like the falling downness of that's associated with this particular cloak has nothing to do with the cloak. So it means still it's appropriate to say that. So I'm wondering if that seems also applies to things like rocks, and I guess I can't think of anything else like a hunk of metal, but I guess if that's all earth, then
Right.
I don't know. There's something, I don't know. There's something missing there. I don't quite get.
Yeah. Well, I'm reflecting on that. Tyler, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to respond to the naming situation.
Oh, cool.
What I think we can say is that if we take ourselves to be naming something, we're presupposing an account, whatever it is that the something is taken to be. So the account comes first. So we don't confer the account through the name. Rather, something already has to have an account to be named, even if we don't explicitly state the account in the naming.
Do you want to explore that just a little bit, Tyler? Because I think you're right, and I think it's a good point, but I think it needs to be fleshed out a bit.
Yeah. So I guess we'll take the flower bed, right? I've already decided that this is one kind of thing in some way before I name it a bed. The bed doesn't give it the properties that are the basis for my deciding it's the kind of thing that should be named one way or another. So in virtue of taking it to be one kind of thing in the first place, right, I've already given it some kind of account, even if it's in my thinking rather than in my language.
Right. So I like that, because by pointing out the flower bed, you're already or the bed of leaves, right? You're distinguishing it from that which it's distinct from, like its boundaries or whatever it bleeds into, right? So you've already in this, you've already grasped a form that distinguishes the plant bed from its surroundings. And the grasp of that which makes this distinct is precisely its similarity to anything that can function as a bed, namely something you can lie down on. And that's probably what you most distinguish, was not the greens changed or the textures changed or the smells changed, but you grasped that the function changes, right, when you get into the mud from the bed of leaves. So you've grasped the functional uniqueness of this, and that is what the Greeks would say you've understood a form, right? A functional unity, and that they often call that the work of the thing, the ergon. You've understood the work of the plant of the bed of leaves. And that's very, very interesting that this is precisely what's going on prior to, or that's the basis for your ability to call it a bed rather than something else, or to make up a name for it, right? We often make up names for things that have no similarities for anything else, or we give them like human names. Okay, So Tyler, do you want to follow up on what I said before I go to Philip?
No, I think I'm good with that.
All right, cool. And then Clark, you're welcome to jump in anytime, of course. Philip.
Yeah, I had another topic I'd like to discuss, but I'll hold off if people want to explore this current topic further.
All right, well, why don't you just launch it, and then we'll see how it intertwines with what we're doing already.
Okay, so at the end of last session, a few people were despairing about their abilities to ever fully understand Aristotle. And I got to thinking, Well, I mean, there's different levels at which you can understand a philosopher, and I came up with something that I think can be understood about Aristotle, and here's what it is. I'm going to say it in an overly schematic way, and then I'll walk it back and make it more complicated. So, generally speaking, I would say that before Aristotle, philosophers would explain one thing in terms of another thing, and they didn't really put any pressure on themselves to make the thing that's doing the explaining be understandable, right? So with Thales, okay, we're going to explain everything in terms of water. Well, what exactly is water? Like, water's doing an awful lot of work. We need a really good theory of water, and we don't get it. And a bit more contentious, you could argue that Plato's theory of forms also sort of explains one thing in terms of another thing, which itself never really gets explained all that well. But when we come to Aristotle, not only is the thing that gets explained supposed to be understood, but the thing that's doing the explaining, Aristotle puts a lot of pressure on himself to say something meaningful about the thing that's doing the explaining, and I think that's new in philosophy. I could be wrong. I said it in an overly schematic way. Yes, it's going to be more complicated, but I think that's something brand new about Aristotle that's quite wonderful, and I think it can be understood by a beginner.
That was beautiful, Philip. Thank you. The details we could argue about, but it doesn't matter. I think the principle of the thought is is incredibly important, and I think it gets at what a lot of philosophers are trying to do. Is not to get at the things explained, but to get at the explainers. How do we understand them, right? And what gives them the capacity to be explainers? Yeah, that's quite great, actually. Thank you, Peter.
I mean, I'd almost like say it's a test of one's intellectual integrity. You know, it seems like a lazy thing to just say, well, I'm going to explain this in terms of, you know, I don't know, Zeus did it. There we go. I'm done. I can go fishing, right? But if you have intellectual integrity, you put pressure on yourself to say something about the thing that's doing the explaining.
Excellent. Yeah. No, I think that's a huge portion of what philosophers, especially, well, philosophers generally are doing. The great ones are the go deepest into that. Peter.
Well, I heard Philip just give us an assignment to read the posterior analytics. That's what that's FYI. Because in that book, Aristotle does go into trying to explain what does it mean to explain something scientifically, and it's not just any set of syllogisms or any set of propositions or whatever they are set up, and there's got to be certain things and the relationships amongst other things. So he does have a really interesting theory on that, and so that is so. I do. Philip's right on Aristotle expanded on what it means to explain something, but even there in the famous last paragraph or last section there, he does say, well, at the pain of an infinite regress, you gotta stop somewhere. The army's retreating, and then one soldier stops, the next soldier stops, and finally they just hold their ground on some sort of he uses epigoge or induction, as it were, as like we basically have some sort of practical, I don't know, we get a base answer through experience in some sense. So there is still that question that's not like, it's not just something like, but there's no explanation. I don't know if there's an explanation from that. So you can't just say, well, Zeus did it. That doesn't explain anything. But given Zeus, and then, well, that Zeus always hates this and the other thing, then maybe that the further things explain it if you know what Zeus's nature is, whether regardless of whether it's right or wrong. But anyway.
No, I think part of the problem is, sorry, go ahead.
No, Phil, please go ahead.
Okay, just quickly, I think part of the problem is that for many people, it feels like an explanation, right? Like if it's raining and somebody says, well, how come it's raining? Oh, Zeus wanted it to rain. Oh, okay, fine. Like for a lot of people, that just feels like an explanation. And it can be quite difficult, perhaps, both for an individual and for a society to see past that and say, oh, wait a minute, that sort of felt like an explanation, but it's not. And that's where Aristotle comes in. Like he never lets us have those sort of emotionally satisfying but intellectually vacuous constructions.
Mike.
just responding to Philip. So that feeling like it's an explanation, I think that just explains most people's tendency to rely on dogma, I guess. Because I'm thinking of, current day like religious advocates, it's not science, COVID, or whatever, it's God's punishment on us, right? Or it's Zeus things, and okay, and we'll make everyone else believe that and abide by that. I don't know. But yeah, I'm not saying I disagree with you, Philip. I totally see that as well.
I just read the Aristotle's Meno, and it was interesting in there about how they discuss what is a definition of something, so that you can have knowledge of something. And I think this is in line with what Philip is saying, is that, I don't have enough background to make a judgment on what Philip said, but it certainly fits how I'm seeing Plato use Socrates, I guess the way to say it. That how do you know a ruminant, is what is a ruminant by definition? Well, it's one that ruminates. That's insufficient as a definition. Or a ruminant. What is a ruminant? Well, it's a cow. It's a horse. It's different hoofed animals, I guess. Well, again, that's just an example.
Exactly.
What a definition of a ruminant is. So in that line, I'd say, that's much better than saying it's because Zeus said it. The problem I see is that this same issue is alive and breathing and kicking and screaming in our current age, where what is it that actually gives authority to definitions, and I see Aristotle working on that, or not, this is Plato, sorry. But anyway, I just thought I'd pipe in on that. That seemed to be connected.
Anybody got any thoughts on that? What I'm just going to throw this out there. It's not quite connected to what we've been talking about, but when we read Aristotle, I think that we tend to think that there's this system, this geometrical system based on certain postulates and axioms, and then he derives a bunch of stuff. So along this kind of rationalistic Cartesian model of thought, and it's a question of whether there is such a thing or not. But that's certainly not the intention I have in reading him the way we've been reading him. I do want to say that Aristotle leaves a lot of questions open. But what he did more than anybody else was to lay the foundations for scientific thought generally. All kinds of different scientific thinking. And which is to say, thinking that not only answers the why question with the appropriate cause, but struggles to show why the cause that you invoke is actually related to the thing you're trying to explain. And so what I would like to say is that Aristotle introduced the West to scientificity, to use a highfalutin phrase, right? If we think of science, we want to say modern science. Obviously, he's not a modern scientist, right? But modern science is just a species of science, right? There's different humanities can be a science, can be systematic, can interrelate all of its cognitions and in a hierarchical, logical manner. But this scientificity, right? What is it to think scientifically how all things are related? That is what he bequeathed to the West, is thinking that. and his science. There's a Thomas scholar, a guy named McCabe, who gives the Aristotelian background to Aquinas, and he says, and he introduces Aristotle not as a philosopher, but as a marine biologist. So Aristotle was this marine biologist, right? And there's some real truth to that, right? Because that was what he studied the most, and his generation of animals and plant species, but especially marine species, is what he really knew. So he was a scientist that bequeathed some special scientists to history, but more than that, he bequeathed the thought of an interrelated whole of cognition that is actually explanatory and isn't built on sand, and that actually make good its explanatory claims. Now, that's not an empirical science. An empirical science, like Peter said, its assumptions have to just begin somewhere. You just got to get to work and kind of see where it goes. But the idea of science as such, the idea that there is this conceptual network of interrelated accounts that mutually explicate one another, right? That we find going on in metaphysics, that opens up the whole idea of scientificity at all, doing things in a scientific way. And it also explores the foundations of science at the same time. Metaphysics explores the foundations of physics. And just as we saw with the concept of change, that to think change is to think matter, form, and potency or lack. And none of these are empirical concepts, and they lead beyond the physics. In order to think them, you have to go to the next level, namely metaphysics. What we're doing is we're investigating the foundations of any science, of anything that changes. And so this is all interlocked, but it's not interlocked in a kind of mathematical, algorithmical way. And so he opens up as many questions as he solves and you can look at the appropriation of Aristotle over the next 1800 years as asking those questions. Okay, he's given us some solid foundations, but he's brought up these other things. Maybe his account of form is inadequate because it seems to be in contradiction with Plato. How do we think this through? And so goes the engine of intellectual history for 1900 years until we get to the early modernity and we get a kind of break. But we don't get a break from the idea of science as such, but only whether a certain kind of science qualifies as science, namely an empirical natural science. So anyway, yeah, let's see. I got Peter first, and then Philip.
Well, I was going to answer Clark, but he ran away.
Okay.
So I'm here. I'm just off camera.
Anyway, I was going to just actually start reading on page 21, which is like 193, A27-ish or so.
So what was Clark's question?
He's still trying to get at what is nature?
Oh, is that related to the Meno thing?
Well, not necessarily the Meno thing, but
okay, cool. Okay, cool.
This is just like, because we've been talking about cloak and what it was made of and, and all that kind of stuff. But so on page 21 near the bottom, it says, and it's one of the short paragraph, last full paragraph, I guess. In one way, then, something is said to be nature when it is the first underlying matter for each of the things that have within themselves a starting point of movement and change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the idea that we were talking about earlier, like, well, why does a cloak fall down? Well, because it's made of matter, right? Mm-hmm. So that was that, because that's the principal underlying stuff it's made out of. And so the nature comes from that. That's one way of getting at where nature is. But the next paragraph, in another way, though, what is said to be nature is the shape, that is the form that is in accord with the account. I don't know how far to read it, but again, so that's going to be a very different answer as to what the nature of something is.
Right. right? But then if you read a little bit further,
I said I didn't know how far to read. I hadn't heard that.
he
much.
definitively says, the top of page 22, he says, in fact, right?
Oh yes, there we
So-
go. It's underlined in red, by the way, up here, right?
Yeah,
there.
in
So-
fact, form is more nature than the matter is.
exactly.
For each thing is said to be when it actually is more than when it potentially is.
And the actually and potentially are underscored even harder.
Right. Right. And so we don't necessarily understand this answer, but we do understand that actuality and potentiality are the salient concepts for thinking about what the right way to think about nature, right? The right way to think about starting points, the starting points of internal motion. So that's just a clue, and that's why we read a little bit about actuality and potency, just to get that thing started, because that's this will, this whole science is going towards these actuality and potentiality, which were not technical terms in Plato. He used them, but not in the technical sense, the explanatory sense that Aristotle used them. And these, of course, are going to be the foundations for thinking about the relationship between cosmology and the nature of the self and theology for quite a while. And so that's why it's so important to get them. And then we'll see how they function in Augustine and Boethius and a couple other people. And it's just utterly fascinating. But anyway, yeah, I got Philip, and then maybe Clark wants to respond to Peter either now or after
We
Philip.
start slapping our hands down
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm still trying to figure it out. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Go ahead,
I'm going to
Philip.
go back to the modern science versus ancient science distinction. And one thing that's just glaringly apparent in Aristotle is he never talks about prediction, or he never talks at least about systematizing prediction, making prediction a big deal. And obviously that is a big part of modern science. And popularizations of Aristotle often make it sound like, oh, well, they were primitive, they didn't even think about these things. But that just can't be right. I mean, the Oracle of Delphi, the fact that they were so impressed when somebody could predict an eclipse, like the ancient Greeks clearly cared about prediction, and they valued it, and they wanted to be able to do it. And yet, it's not really there in Aristotle. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I'm going to tentatively suggest something that maybe it was associated with the more vulgar arts, the more like engineering or shipbuilding or something more along the lines of what the hoi polloi would do, whereas Aristotle saw himself as doing something loftier than mere engineering or a practical science. That's a tentative suggestion. I don't know if that's true. Maybe other people do.
I'm wondering, Philip, though, if you're not inadvertently putting modern science criteria into Aristotle by saying, by accentuating the predictive aspect, the Oracle of Delphi, or that you're trying to find the predict instances where making a prediction is important.
It's possible. Okay, well, let's say I was doing that. What more would you say about that if I were?
I guess what I'm saying is, if from first principles we found that making predictions is central to our metaphysics, then I'd say yes. But to me, it's, and not really knowing where you're coming from, but it does seem to me the notion of predictions comes from modern science. The scientific method, doing experiments. If it happens 9 times out of 10, then it's got maybe a strong predictive quality. And it seems like now you're looking for that in Aristotle. And to me, trying to find the power of prediction in Aristotle, it doesn't seem to me to have come from first principles. It seems to me it's coming from modern science tenets. But I could be misunderstanding you as well.
But I think it's a legitimate contrast, at least, to say that there's these two different goals going on in what Aristotle's trying to do, and that, yeah, I see a couple of hands, so I'm gonna wait to comment before I get Peter and then Clark in, and then Philip, if you want to respond, let's hear from these two, and then you're welcome to respond.
I will. Yeah, I will.
Yeah, so it's an interesting distinction between well, there's certainly something that I think we all agree there's something different between modern science and what Aristotle's doing. Now the question is that at root a difference in whether you're trying to predict things or not? And I think that prediction does, I think, go back a long way. People cared about the crops, predicting the rain, and they wanted good fortune. They always wanted fortune tellers and all that kind of stuff. So maybe it's not quite that, but it's rather the obsession that modern science has with the quantitative. The quantitative is a very powerful tool, but I'm not sure and leads to lots of very precise predictions. So there's where that prediction thing comes in, but I don't know if it's the heart of the thing is the predictive thing, but the quantitative thing is a very given that you find these laws of nature and you can crank all the things through, you get but you don't get any understanding from the quantitative. The quantitative is precisely that which abstracts from any of the context that would give you which is exactly what Aristotle is trying to get at. What is the principles involved here? We see this in the Hegel thing, the whole observing nature thing for all of you guys who are in there. That's really I think that's a lot of what he's talking about in there, is that by concentrating on quantity abstracts from quality. And I think even in the science of logic, quality comes before quantity in the explication, which leads you to believe that really it's quality, the quantity is derivative. And so it's backwards to try and explain the qualitative in terms of the quantitative. That's doing things backwards, roughly.
I just wanted to quickly add in, just to cut in front of Clark. Sorry. I think it's not the obsession with quantity is not just in science, but I think it pervades all our lives, right? Especially, and what I mean specifically is in terms of money, right? Like if I have two houses, how do I evaluate whether one house is better than the other? Oh, but if you tell me the price, oh yeah, this house is better, right? Just wanted to add that.
You're describing my current management right now. I think that by looking at their spreadsheets, they have any understanding about what's going on in the project, but I didn't say that.
This is being recorded. Okay, Clark, go ahead before Peter puts his other foot in his mouth.
Yeah, I just want two things. Three things. Peter, thank you for going back to nature. I still would love to talk about that. And I like the passages that you read. I think they do relate. I'd like to probe those a little more. Yeah. Philip, I think you bringing up science the way you did was invited by Michael, or I should say Aristotle, because that's who Michael was talking about, how Aristotle considered there are different sciences. They're all sciences. There's something about science, as Aristotle defines it, though, that is common to all the sciences. So there's a synonymy to it. But I want to say that with you, I think you're saying there's also a homonymy with it. There's a discrepancy in the accounts. And now we're talking about that more directly. And I can say, this is a huge subject, but I'm deeply concerned about the homonymy that's going on in the discussion of modern science right now, as a matter of fact, because accounts need to be made about what we mean by modern science. It's very difficult to distill down. It's actually a narrative, in my view. And it's difficult because it's a social way of organizing human behavior. I mean, it's a method, it's a process by which we this is all Clark, right? I mean, I'd have to make a pitch for this, but independent replication, predictions coming from it within a social environment that both competes and cooperates is the definition for me in a most general sense of modern science. And anything else references to numbers, for instance, or to quantification versus qualification, qualities. You know, I think that opens up a whole set of issues for me that I find so fascinating, that Aristotle seems, and most of the Greeks are just fascinated with the possibility that math may actually be synonymous with human thinking. That is, logic and math are synonymous with how we actually do come to understand and create accounts for what nature is and all this. There's a mathematics that actually was broken, that whole tying to thought, human thought and mathematics in the 17th century was just severed. So math went independently more in a certain way, and it left human thinking as being the guide for our thinking. And I'm making a lot of points here, but it just seems to me that the influence of math, logic, geometry in the ancient world on how we're going to solve our problems and think as human beings was tried for a couple thousand years, and then it came up short. And this is a bigger issue, I know, that we're going to study, I hope, you know, in the other issues. But anyway, I'm just throwing out a lot of garbage stuff here. Check.
No, it's not garbage because it's coming from you.
Yeah.
It's
well, it's throwing a lot of stuff out though that is somewhat disconnected, and my account
no.
is not bringing them together. So that's what I mean.
But that's why we talk about this stuff, because as you practice it, it comes together.
Yeah.
Philip,
Yeah.
Philip, you've been very patient. Do you want to jump in?
You're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Sorry about that. Okay, I would say that what I'm doing is the opposite of reading modern concerns back into Aristotle. So I'm going to set up what I would take to be a straw man modernist reading of Aristotle, and then I'm going to show how what I'm doing is different from that. So I would say like this, the modernist would look at Aristotle and say, oh, well, clearly and obviously, prediction is the heart of science. Prediction is what science is all about, so says the modernist. And Aristotle wasn't doing that. So therefore, Aristotle wasn't doing science, or he just didn't have the right concepts, or he just didn't see the importance of it or something. Poor Aristotle. All right, so I would counter that modernist by saying, look, the Greeks actually had a very rich vocabulary with which to talk about prediction. They had the Oracle of Delphi, and let's not forget, the Oracle of Delphi is the ultimate in non-mathematical, non-algorithmic prediction, right? You get really high on the fumes from the earth and you say stuff. That is not math the way I was taught it, sadly. So you know, we've got a very non-algorithmic version of prediction coming from the Oracle of Delphi. We have a very mathematical version of prediction already alive and well in the ancient world. And Aristotle chooses, I would say, to ignore that. He's not just unaware that prediction is a thing. He actively seems to avoid it. And so I would say I'm giving a very non-modernist reading, where Aristotle is doing something active in relation to the idea of prediction. He's deliberately avoiding it. I'd like to know more about why he's doing that. But so I take my reading to be quite anti-modernist.
Interesting. Thanks.
There's no progress. There's no reason to predict. We want progress. We have to predict things. Like when our dumb projects
So we have to get better and better and better at it. You know, I think everybody would agree that there's lots of different ways to frame the contrast between the ancients and the moderns. And so none of them are necessarily privileged. And we're only stuck talking about this because Aristotle haunts the modern memory, right, as that which, you know, we succeeded in leaving behind. Right? That's the specter that haunts the imagination of modernity. Is this Aristotle? And he got everything. And modernity begins with the rejection of Aristotle. So if we read Aristotle, we always have to read Aristotle, you know, de facto against this background. Right. And so the only way to begin to take Aristotle seriously is to start putting into question this particular narrative. And so that's kind of why we find ourselves doing this kind of debate. And they're necessary. I'm not poo-pooing them. They're necessary in order to drive a wedge between our assumptions about Aristotle and what he actually said. So we go to the physics, and he doesn't say things change and let's measure that change. He says, is there change? And that's just a different kind of question, right? That's not a predictive kind of question. That's like what, and here we recognize the provenance of the Platonic Academy, right? He is coming from an inquiry into what things are, and not only what their being is. What's the being of a living thing? What's the difference between the being of a living thing and an artifact, right? But what's being? And what must be thought to think being at all? And how is thinking being possible at all, right? So all of those questions are what we today might call metaphysical or philosophical ones. And they're the ones that he's engaging with when he approaches things that change. What is their being? Right? And so that's the kind of narrative that I'm introducing this course with, or I introduced this course with. The whole idea is that the Greeks struggle to think being, and we think the moderns are not so interested in being. They're more interested in what can we do with things? What are their capacities that we can use? How can we exploit them, right? And that's a very important question, and it's a very good. What I want to say is, we need science. Science is great, but it's a different set of questions. It's not interested in the being of anything, but rather the behaviors of things, and through prediction, we gain control. That was the mantra of the early moderns. Through predictions, we control. Right? If we understand the regularities of things, we can exploit that, we can adapt it, all the rest of it, right? And that's good. We need to control our environment. I'm not against science, but thinking what things are, and by extension, thinking what we are, and not just what you can do with human bodies, or what you can do with human thoughts, and how we can improve some people's lives with human thoughts, right? Just what are we? We need to think about how to think about being before we can ask ourselves the question, what are we? And what is our place in the world? And what's good for us? And therefore, what is the right kind of society for us? And is religion good or bad for us? Is tyranny good or bad for us? Well, we need to know who we are in order to be able to answer those questions. So I've cast this whole endeavor into the Greeks, as they show us what it means to struggle to comprehend being, entirely independently of any practical effects that might fall out, might precipitate from that inquiry. They precipitate accidentally. They're not the focus, they're not the concern. We'll let the engineers deal with that. Right? Just like mathematicians, they work all of their mathematics, and some of it is useful for natural science, and some of it's useful for engineering, and it's not. That's the problem of physicists and engineers. We mathematicians, we just work out the inner logic of the mathematical models and all the rest of it. Well, the Greeks were just working out the inner logic of being, and if it had useful consequences, great, and if it didn't, well. And I love Aristotle for this. He says, philosophy is the only free science. It's the only form of thinking freely because it's not tied to some practical purpose. And in the freedom of thought, we can nothing obstructs us, nothing impedes us from thinking things as they are, rather than as they are useful to us. And we moderns, and that's my thesis, and that's one of the things I'm arguing for, are so used to conflating these things. What things are is precisely how they're useful to us, that we have lost, in Heideggerian terms, we do not know how to inquire into being. And instead, we replace that with the acquisition of power. And so that's why we have the primacy of the political instead of the primacy of the metaphysics in modernity and late modernity. So that's the overarching frame. That's the kind of narrative that I'm fleshing out as an opportunity for everybody to reflect on themselves and their relationship to the Greeks and the relationship to modernity and the relationship to politics and power from a radically different perspective, but one that is grounded in a certain set of thinkers that got the whole ball rolling in the first place. Right. So Clark, I see your hand.
I found it really enjoyable what you just said, Michael, and I'm puzzled at the same time. Am I engaging in learning Aristotle because it lacked any practical purpose? Now, I know you're not saying that would be the case, but you are making a distinction between, well, with what Aristotle does in probing the meaning of being and what modern science does, which you're characterizing as being practical.
Right.
And I think that's a dichotomous frame that doesn't fit what I'm doing here in this group. I am actually, the Desert Fathers used to talk about how could it be possibly relevant to go out and pray to God and beat yourself with horse, wear camel hair shirts, and how could this possibly be productive of anything? And it manifestly was productive. I mean, that the whole point of humans doing things is that we are doing things because they result in something. So I'm not sure the dichotomy that you're making holds. It sounds nice, but it seems a little simplistic to me on terms of how I'm experiencing myself engaged in learning Aristotle. I'm getting tons from Aristotle. The more I disagree with him, the more I'm learning. It's weird. Excellent. Or the more I'm agreeing with him, the more I'm learning. It doesn't matter. It can go both ways. There's a certain self-awareness that you gain by thinking about being.
Right.
Yes. And particularly because it's so opposite of what our culture has patience for. But yes, I just want to say one more. Yeah.
Oh, please do.
One more thing, and it has to do with power. So if, and virtually almost all, I mean, I have read some Popper, but virtually all my understanding of modern science comes from David Wooten in his massive, beautiful book, The Invention of Science, which I've read backwards and forwards many times. But the whole picture that he paints in the 17th century was that power was out of control. In many ways, modern science was brought about, the impetus for it, the roots of it, were brought about because of complete frustration with the inability to resolve conflict and deal with authority, and the close association with the contemplators of being and how they held authority and power in the 16th and 17th century was actually what people rebelled against. That was the impetus for much of what was going on. You read Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, the French dude, sorry about that. I'm losing.
The one and only
I could do more. He's so fabulous, though. His utter frustration, with the world as it was, people dying of the plague, the wars of the religion, the wars of the magistrates. He went up to his cabin, and he carved into the beams of the ceiling of his cabin. He goes, what do we really know? We know nothing. We know nothing. I go to a doctor and I'm more likely to get killed than to get healed. The world was completely, things were out of control, and it was done in the name of Aristotle
Mm.
in many ways. Not that I'm saying that that's the case.
Understood,
It's how they
understood.
represented it. It's how they
Exactly.
represented it. Now, whether that's true or not, I'd love to probe further. I think Aristotle gets a heap of disingenuous and unwarranted criticism as I'm learning, you know, trying to study
Right,
more directly.
right.
So anyway,
So,
thank you for.
no, that's
yeah.
awesome. I love it, Clark. And one hand, we want to do more justice to Aristotle, and he's at fault for whatever he's at fault for, but we don't know what that is yet. Secondly, we want to be exercising our capacities to think being, and not to problem solve, as I always put in scare quotes, is the modern substitute for thinking being. And thinking being is just a different intellectual muscle than what we're used to using in solving math problems and solving science problems and solving therapy problems and marriage problems, right? We're always solving fucking problems. As if that were the essence of thought. And nobody has time solving so many problems to think thought very much. And this is the great luxury of what we're doing, is that we can, outside of all problems, just recapitulate in our own thought, the Greek thought about thought, and exercise that muscle. And who knows what wonderful things will come of it. I don't know. But to begin to learn to think, not just because to think like the Greeks do. We're not trying to think like the Greeks. We're trying to think being, and the Greeks are the ones who did it. That's the thesis. All right. So there were a couple hands. I got Philip. Somebody else was up there too. Was it Peter? No. Anyway. But yeah, let's get Philip, and then if whoever had their hand up, if they wouldn't mind getting it back up.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
So, okay, we've been talking as though the big distinction is practical versus something else. Okay, so non-practical. But I'm not sure that's true. Certainly Aristotle appreciated the element of practicality and the idea of problem solving. I mean, in the politics, right, he's very much concerned with solving some problems. What's the right form of government? I want to suggest tentatively, I'm not sure about this, but that it's really a matter of vulgarity versus loftiness, right? So that certain subjects are just vulgar. Tilling the soil, predicting an eclipse. Like, some things are just seen as vulgar in Aristotle, and other topics are seen as lofty. Does that go anywhere for anybody?
It seems like an invidious psychological distinction to bring in here, right? And I just don't see it in the texts. Right? And I just want to say, he's engaged with Plato, and is Plato's account of being complete and adequate? And if not, how does one engage with that theory complex in a way that doesn't lose any of the insights, but doesn't fall into what Aristotle thinks are some of the pitfalls of Platonism? And then that's and Plato was trying to get our souls in order so that we could live in a peaceful civic order, and so that we could flourish, right? That's what he's trying to do, and that's not loftiness or anything. So I'm just pushing back against that a little bit, but I see a couple other hands, so I'm going to see what Peter has to say here.
So I'm going to go push back again and try another run at this, that something about the quantitative or the mathematical is kind of the heart of modern science, say from Galileo or somewhere, and I don't care where you draw the line, but roughly back in that era. I mean, take a look what Descartes does. He marries quantity and geometry. And that is opens up a whole range of techniques and power and whatnot. There's something very mathematical and I think ultimately quantitative about modern science. And I think that what Aristotle and the Greeks were doing, yeah, they were fascinated by numbers as well, right? I mean, they did a lot of mathematics in their own thing. But what Aristotle is doing, for instance, in the physics here, is not a quantitative study of motion. In fact, you might even argue that part of what Zeno's paradoxes are is if you try and go down the mathematical route, in some sense, you end up in grief, right? You can't.
Continuum.
Yeah, the continuum, that's that mathematical thing, dividing things up and blah, blah, blah. But Aristotle's saying, no. Let's have a completely different and it's not his account of motion as the actualization of potential is, there's nothing quantitative about that. It's about the qualitative relationships of things. It's a different paradigm of things.
Right.
And again, I think that by abstracting, by turning the relationship of whatever it is, of, following something or other, and making Descartes and modern science do, plotting the motion, taking derivatives and integrals of it all, that's very powerful. You can do a lot of calculation, you can do a lot of prediction, but again, you've missed the essential relationship. You've described a path that something might take to some certain degree of accuracy, but we haven't explained why the thing is moving.
Excellent point. I like that a lot. And I did want to give Philip also, credit where credit is due. You're right. Aristotle's interested in solving some problems, and he has, he's basically the creator of practical philosophy, right? Which is the philosophy that investigates the kinds of change. But he always relates the practical back to the nature of the thing and whether it has intrinsic principles that would explain the kinds of changes that it's regularly exhibits or not. And so I don't want to deny that there's this practical side to Aristotle. You're right to point that out, that's not what I wanted to say. But that always there is the priority of what he calls theoria, right? And which gets translated into Latin as contemplatio, right? So there is the priority of contemplation as that attitude of mind that is concerned exclusively with the nature or the being of the thing that I'm inquiring into, and does not subject it to any subjective, social, historical conditions before examining it. That would put it in the realm of the practical. And so if we get that theoretical versus practical distinction down in an Aristotelian way, we can understand both why the practical interests him and how it's always tied back to the question of being. So Philip, I see your hand, so go ahead and respond, or bring up something new if you want.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was going to announce a meetup of mine at the start of this,
cool.
And I didn't do that. So help me pick a time for that before everybody leaves. So I'm just going to run a little bit more with this idea of vulgarity. I'm not deeply committed to this reading, but I just want to run with it a little more. Now, a lot of scholars say that the Nicomachean Ethics is not a work of ethics as we tend to mean it. It's not about how to live your individual life, that it's actually like a prolegomena to the politics. It's about how to create the sort of non-vulgar, cultured, well-rounded person, man, who can then go on to do politics. So it seems like there is this aristocratic streak running through Aristotle, the idea that, the man who can do politics is not somebody who's guided by algorithms. Like, to find the golden mean in the Nicomachean Ethics is not an algorithm. It's not like, okay, there's foolhardiness over here, and there's cowardice over here and recklessness over there, and now we need an algorithm to figure out what is the golden mean between those two. No, it's that somebody who is well raised, who is noble and aristocratic, they can find it. It does seem like Aristotle sees vulgarity as the enemy of his thought in many, many places. In the politics, there are types of government that won't work because they let the vulgar have too much of a say. So I'm just kind of trying to run with this a little bit. I think the idea of vulgarity is extremely relevant in the politics, and I'm wondering if it's relevant in his other thought. I'm not deeply attached to this. I'm just kind of seeing if it goes anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I've offered my 2 cents. Does anybody else have a thought about that?
I only have a couple of drachmas.
Right. I mean, that's just I don't know if it's Cicero or I don't know if it's directly in Aristotle. I think it's directly in Aristotle. He says, yes, I'm a friend of Plato, but more of truth. And if there was something vulgar that were true, I think that Aristotle would espouse it, even if he did recognize its vulgarity. So, and maybe.
I got to jump in, but that's exactly what he doesn't do. He like the predictions of the people who can find the eclipses. He knows it's true. He knows that people can predict things like that, and he sort of very aristocratically turns his eye away from it. It seems to me.
Well, I encourage you to explore the hypothesis and see how far it gets you. See how far it gets you. For me, it has a little bit too much of a psychologistic flavor to it, which is kind of perverts the outcomes. Right? If we're philosophers, we're supposedly, hopefully, most interested in truth, and so seeing how that plays out. Obviously, there's something bad about the vulgar because of its disorder, and it wouldn't be vulgar if it weren't disorder and desiring this and desiring that, and there's no order to the life, and so a polis that projects this vulgar soul will be a polis that is itself in disorder, and the good of the polis will never materialize. So there's maybe reasons concerning the nature of the soul that an inquiry interested in truth would uncover that would give us a little bit more traction on the rejection of what you're calling the vulgar, and that Plato refers to in terms of the disordered soul. But yeah, I mean, like I said, if it's an insight and it's interesting, you should explore it and see how far it goes. That's one of the super important things in philosophy: see how far something goes. Yeah, that might yield insight. That's great. Before we peter out, I think we might already start to be losing a member or two. We got a couple announcements. One of them is Philip's, and then one is mine. So, Philip, why don't you go ahead and let us know what you're offering?
Yeah. Okay. So, as far as I know, there aren't any high-quality meetups that do 21st century philosophy. And if I'm wrong about that, let me know and I'll join it. But I'm offering to do one. I'm offering to host a meetup on 21st century philosophy. We would read books and occasionally essays. Now, here's the problem. I'm disabled. I have severe problems with my immune system. It affects my eyes. It affects my hands. It affects a lot of things. So I need somebody to handle the Zoom. I need somebody to set up the Zoom account. Now, I'm hoping this will be a fairly small group, and so that the raise hands function won't be needed, and I can moderate. However, if it's a big group and we need the raise hands feature, then let's say you're my tech support person, I might need you to handle that a little bit. So I'm looking for a volunteer, and what you get is, I think, a very high-quality meetup on 21st century philosophy. I will try to alternate dense, difficult books with lighter books that I hope the quality of the philosophy will still be good, but they'll be an easier read. And one thing is, I happened very briefly to be a very small part of the Pittsburgh School of Philosophy, Robert Brandom, John McDowell, that sort of stuff. And so I would be doing some of that at some point. And I think that would be unique in these meetups. Nobody else seems to be covering that stuff. And I'm not going to claim to be an expert, but I think I could do a reasonable job presenting Brandom and those people.
Cool.
So volunteers would be appreciated.
All right. Unless there's one right now, you can think about it and mull it over. And if it seems like something, you can reach out to Philip on Meetup, certainly.
Yeah,
So,
it sounds like a great idea, Philip. And I'd love to be part of it, but I can't fit any more in my schedule. I've got too much going on, but maybe I'll be able to be a fly on the wall.
Fair enough. Well,
but anyway, it sounds wonderful, and yeah.
Be a participant. Great. If you, once it happens, if it happens, it's not going to happen if I don't get a volunteer. But if it happens, then please join up.
Okay, cool. Well, and so unfortunately, I too am adding to people's heaping portions of philosophy that you get every week. So this is the first time, and perhaps the last time, that we get to just talk generally about Aristotle for 2 full hours. I found it incredibly productive and stimulating, so I'm glad for everybody being here. What's going to happen from now on is on our off Thursdays. So 2 weeks from now, there's a meetup that's been announced called Modernity and Platonism, or Platonism and Modernity. And we're going to read some selections from this text, because I think it's very, very important. The attack that the author levies against the way in which knowledge was conceptualized in early modernity has, led to all the skeptical impasses, and all skeptical impasses always invite a dogmatic response. It's just like, well, we can't know, so let's just do blah. Right? That's a modern thing. Either we don't know, or we're just dogmatically deciding to do this, that, and the other thing, because we don't have any reasons on one side or the other to put into question whether we should be doing that. So anyway, I think this book is great. Several people in our Aristotle group have read it, the lion's share of it, with me, and except for one person, everybody thought it was really, really good. Who shall remain nameless, who found it awful. But okay, you can't have everything. Now, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reading not the whole thing. It's like 600 pages. I'm not going to ask anybody to do that, but we'll be reading selections of it, because it does 2 things. It criticizes modernity from the perspective of Aristotle and Plato, and it's called Platonism, but it's really a melange, a composite of the Platonic Aristotelian philosophy as it was developed from 200 to 600 AD. That's when it reached its great flowering. And so this author, Schmidt, he is basically thinking about this great flowering of the Aristotelian Platonic philosophy, and using it to exemplify not only the skeptical impasses that are due to an inadequate conception of knowledge that characterize modernity, but very, very interestingly, pursues this line of inquiry into ethics and politics and economics to show the superiority of what he thinks is the superiority of the Platonic Aristotelian mode of conceptualization of these different human domains. So, what we're doing in the Aristotle seminar is reading Aristotle, and then every once in a while kind of taking a side look at the difference between modernity and antiquity. The Schmidt book will allow us to address that frontally, right? So it's not just something we slip in every once in a while. It will be a different seminar, and it will be totally based on this critique of modernity from the Greek perspective. And so, in a way, it will more immediately address some of the questions that were brought up today, and give lots of rich historical detail, and also very rigorous conceptual articulations of what he takes to be the fundamental differences in how thinking is thought in antiquity and modernity, and what the advantages are of thinking not as computation, but as reflection in the Greek manner. So anyway, so what's going to happen is every other Thursday, we'll be reading passages from this book for the very first hour. And then the second hour, we're going to stop at 1 hour, and then second hour is just kind of open. We can talk about Aristotle, we can talk about Schmidt, we can talk about both of them, we can talk about these general issues. And so we'll have an hour, or if you'd like, an hour and a half for open discussion, observations, objections, and just kind of airing things out that are a little bit hard to institutionalize within a text seminar like Aristotle is supposed to be. So that's what's happening here at this time. From 4 to 5, we'll be talking about Schmidt exclusively. And from 5 on, open forum. We can continue talking about Schmidt, or we can bring other subjects to the floor. So that's my announcement.
Do you want to give some homework right off the bat there?
Well, I did. It's already announced on Meetup.
Oh, it is. Okay, I'll check it out. Thank you.
Okay, but so I have a link to the book, which is this Arbogast Schmidt, Platonism and Modernity, and it's the translator. It's the author's forward to the English edition, and then from his lengthy introduction to the actual book, it's pages 12 to 30. It's where he introduces some of the distinctions that he was going to work out in perhaps painful detail later on in the book. But like I said, we're not going to be reading every page. At least
don't worry.
Huh?
Don't worry. I won't mention that in chapter 12. He gives a really wonderful summary. All those, I think it's chapter 12, all those bullet points, like a paragraph of each major chapter. And it's a summary that always reminds me of, but I won't mention it. Don't worry.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for not mentioning that there, Peter. That's helpful.
Right. So yeah, I'm done with my announcement. Anything else? Maybe we snuck the announcements in a little bit too early. We got 20 minutes if we want, but is there any lingering questions? I can be here till 6, definitely. So we have 20 minutes. If there's anything else that you wanted, you hope to air that you haven't got around to yet, let's do it.
I could go briefly just back to Peter's mention of math and
cool
quantity, and that, and so the early kind of forebears of modern science in the 16th and 17th century, they were incredibly excited. They way overmade a case for how numbers can free us from from authority, tradition, revelation. Numbers, and they made a lot of wild claims. And my view, as far as modern science goes, is yeah, indeed, there's no question that there's a quantitative emphasis that was lacking prior to the modern science era. But it's also overblown, in my opinion, by being used as a foil to argue against the weaknesses of modern science. In other words, to me, in my view, it's exaggerated the role actually that numbers play, because modern science is more than just number crunching or turning things into numbers.
Well, it's a
process. It's a process that's a social process of human beings interacting, and that's the main aspect. So I would formulate it this way. I would say, yeah, numbers necessary, but not in any way sufficient to describing what goes on with modern science. I just throw that out.
No, I agree. I mean, any human endeavor is going to be embedded in in social context and relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Greek science was the same way, right?
Right.
But that being said, it's still the what it is that they are doing. While it may not just be, it's not just merely numbers, but mathematical laws. Physics, of course, is the most obvious example. You have to like how many years of graduate math before you can become productive in physics, right? Same thing with like, I know electrical
Sure.
engineers are the same way. It's all math,
Yeah.
and high level math.
Yep.
And the question is, so what does the math at that, so not just numbers, but math at the level of math, what is it doing? Is it actually finding insight, or is it just merely describing?
Redescribing.
I'd say it's that latter bit. You know, what do we
Yeah,
do with?
I would say it's merely describing, but it doesn't encompass what science is about. That's an aspect of doing science in certain realms. But I wouldn't suggest, I wouldn't say that would be what characterizes science, modern science. So that's maybe where we differ.
Well, I didn't mean to say this was a total characterization of science. I was trying to say, I think one of the differences
Okay.
between modern science and the Aristotelian science are both embedded in social practices, but the Aristotelian, or ancient Greek thought, and certainly philosophy is a separate issue as well, but it's not the quantitative or the mathematical pursuit of something. It's not describing from the outside things or trying to get at what is the essence of things. And I don't think that modern science can get at has abandoned the internal essences of things and is trying to describe from the outside. Math is a very useful tool for doing that.
Sure.
But I think the tail wagging the dog that's wagging the tail here is the external descriptive approach that is embodied, or one of its signs, if you want to say it, is the level of math that you need to do, because math is an extrinsic description. The mathematical relationships are always extrinsic descriptions of, and given that they're extrinsic, they only happen only coincidentally about something.
Right. Which is a distinction that you wouldn't necessarily learn in the mathematics, because you wouldn't be thinking about the relationship between math. Math doesn't think about the relationship between math and that which is mathematizable, and whether it's mathematizable coincidentally or essentially. That's a classically philosophical Aristotelian kind of question, and you only get it into view when you start asking those kind of questions and sharpening the concepts that are relevant for inquiring into that. But I think that what I like about what Peter's saying is that, Aristotle's after explanations, and redescriptions are not explanations. Redescriptions beg for explanations. And to the extent to which the quantitative is a mere redescription of what was given in particular qualitative experiences, what it does is it allows us to project it in time into an indefinite future or an indefinite past, and thereby make predictions. And there we have again that the reason why we quantify is for the predictive capacity that quantification gives us. And this gets at the nature of the kind of knowledge that we seek to attain in modern science, and that not only creates all sorts of epistemological problems about whether that can be counted as knowledge at all, but it's just simply very, very different from what the Greeks were doing, right? Which in all of the great philosophical activities, it was always oriented towards the question, or towards the demand, the Delphic demand, know thyself. It was self-understanding. The physics and the politics and the metaphysics all inquire into, and it's who are we? And one thing might think that is too much navel gazing, and you might hold that against the Greeks. And it's not the kind of thinking that yields very much power, but it is the kind of thinking that that situates, that it's the kind of thinking that, let me put it this way, allows us to think being. Because and I'm just going to leave it at that because I see Philip's hands up, and I can explain that at another time. But I think there is something fundamentally related between the reflectivity of Greek thought and the access they have to what they and we call being. That being is only gained in this reflexive turn, in this self-knowledge. But that's not something I've really explored very much. So I'm just putting my finger on it as something that hopefully we'll get to one of these years, and let Philip talk.
Yeah, so one thing that might be relevant is we're talking in terms of quantification. If you want quantification at the time of Aristotle, go to India. Those are the people who thought about numbers. In Greece, they thought about magnitudes. And this is something we don't really think in terms of anymore, but they were geometers. Like India was where you went to learn your algebra, and Greece is where you went to learn your geometry. If you could travel. So for the Greeks, what we would call the number 5 was a length. It was a magnitude. It wasn't a number as we think of it. And this has so many consequences. I'm more just suggesting that you take the time to kind of think this way for a little while, because it changes everything in math. For example, the idea of 0 becomes ridiculous if you're thinking in terms of magnitudes, but it isn't ridiculous if you're thinking in terms of numbers, and you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, something, I don't know, like all of a sudden 0 shows up. If you're thinking in terms of quantities, if you're thinking in terms of magnitudes, 0 just seems ridiculous, and that's obviously a big part of why the Greeks never really had the idea of 0. So that's one thing. The other thing people were talking about was physics and mathematics. And, well, here's the dirty little secret of physics. They don't know that much math. They really don't. Like, it's, like math and physics kind of split in the 18th century, 19th century, around the time of axiom systems, right, where mathematicians would come up with a set of axioms and explore the consequences of those axioms, whereas physicists, they don't tend to think that way. And they usually outsource their math to mathematicians who get paid the price of a pencil, whereas the physicists get the $6 billion particle accelerator. And you can tell, yes, I'm much more associated with math than physics. So, for example, and physicists tend to think that math comes from God, or that math is just prepackaged, it's just there, available whenever they need it, but it isn't. It's made by people. So let me give you an example. Like at one point, the math community just sort of decided to represent time as a line, right? So X and Y axis, we're going to take a spatial thing, namely that vertical line, and we're going to represent time in terms of that line. Now, later on, somebody comes up with a theory that time just is space. And you got to ask yourself, is that somehow just a consequence of how we chose to represent time? Like we chose to represent it as space, and now somehow we've convinced ourselves that it is space. Now, I'm not claiming that's a refutation of Einstein by any stretch, but it does make you wonder, because this kind of thing happens a lot, where mathematicians decide to represent something one way, and then it kind of starts to seem like it's true of the real world, and we should be wary of that.
Excellent. Very, very good point. Yeah, I think that happens all the time. We talk about causal closure in physics which is, of course, a methodological demand for the kind of explanation that's allowed in physics, for good reason. But to say that things are causally closed is simply to, reify a methodological postulate. And that happens in people's thinking about science all the time, is that aspects of method are then simply assumed to be what's real.
Incidentally, if you want to explore a philosopher who asks these questions, I'd recommend Tim Maudlin. He believes that the reason we're having so many problems with quantum mechanics is because we've just made bad math choices in history, and we need to make better math choices. So he explores two concepts, equality versus equivalence. He has a distinction between equality and equivalence that he is exploring. It's not easy stuff. You got to know your math, but it is. He is a philosopher that's the kind of department he's in anyway.
Interesting.
A different take on that would be to say that the reason in quantum physics and all that sort of stuff isn't a problem is that they're trying to explain the phenomenon. They're trying to do their explanation in the backwards. They're explaining what is the result in terms as if they're using what is actually the phenomenon to try to explain the noumena, as it were. And that is always going to end in grief. You said they got it exactly backwards anyway.
I think an example is like electrons, right? They've been quantified into like spin, charge, mass. So how it reacts to other particles and all that. And that's how we know electrons within the physics realm. But really, what do we know about electrons, right?
We know that they're, I'm going to be quiet.
Oh, Peter, you're taking over the polemical side. I like it. I think you need to sharpen your knives a little bit more.
I'm sharpening my knives for the idiots at work.
Okay.
Oh, please share, Peter.
It's too horrible. I wouldn't want to.
It's too horrible. Yeah.
Peter, you gotta share. We'll turn off the recording.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I'll turn off the recording. We're heading to almost 6 o'clock anyway. So
Okay.